Jake, your resident content cowboy here, Yeehaw, and these are the weakest releases in Pokemon Unite history. There have been weak releases, mid-releases, and frankly, I don't think any overpowered releases in Pokemon Unite history, but this video is all about the weak ones, the ones where these Pokemon needed some buffs before they even became viable inside the game. I'm going to start with a few honorable mentions that did not make the list, but they are a few Pokemon we should talk about. Honorable mention number 1 is Gardevoir. Releasing in a decently powerful state right at the start of the game, basically, this Pokemon did not set the world on fire, and you wouldn't expect it to. It is a psychic type Pokemon, but that being said, it was a little surprising that this Pokemon was not more powerful upon release. Not bad, just pretty mid. Speaking of mid, another Pokemon that really didn't shine upon release was Espeon. Espeon had a few good things inside of its kit, but it needed a lot of buffs before it became a mainstay Pokemon on competitive or even solo queue teams. It felt like stored power was just far too weak. It felt like Psybeam just didn't do enough damage. It felt like its boosted attack really tickled enemies instead of hurting them. After a few buffs though, Espeon became a really good Pokemon, and I think it's still in a very solid place in today's game. And then of course Urshifu. I know what you're thinking, how on earth could Urshifu be on this list? The only reason it's here is to talk briefly about the Rapid Strike style build, the Water Bear build, which was straight up bad, especially when you compared it to Dark Bear. Wicked Blow was insane, the Unite move was insane, and without question Water Bear needed a little bit of a tune-up. Maybe it got a little too much of a tune-up in the coming weeks because now that build is absolutely insane. That being said, Water Bear did come out very mid. Now, let's get to our top 10. For our number 10 Pokemon, I'm actually going to give it to two Pokemon upon the game's release. First off, Garchomp. Garchomp was bad for so long, it's kind of unbelievable. With such a popular Pokemon, I'm surprised it took them so long to make this thing good. Now Garchomp is actually finally decent, but for the longest time in Pokemon Unite history, this was a fan favorite Pokemon. A lot of players loved it and got really good with it, even though it just wasn't up to the level of other Pokemon inside the game. Another Pokemon that released pretty weak that I think people forget about is Venusaur. Venusaur needed multiple buffs upon release. The Petal Dance Giga Drain build just was not working the way it was intended. Solar Beam was not doing enough damage, and in general, Venusaur was just kind of upon the game's release. It did quickly get buffed, and it found its way into the meta pretty fast after that, but release Venusaur was bad. Our number 9 Pokemon on the list is Clefable. I don't think Clefable was actually super terrible upon release. It was just very focused on healing, and it was not the best at really that or kind of anything else inside of its kit. It got multiple buffs after its release, and it needed them, and it got one of the best nerfs inside the game. I don't know if you remember the sound of Clefable's Moonlight when it first launched, but holy, I am so glad that they nerfed that very loud ambulance sound. Our number 8 Pokemon is Scissor and Scyther, but really it's Scissor. You know, the interesting thing about this Pokemon and the reason it's so low on this list is because it did have that dual path. You could pick either Scissor or Scyther, and Scyther was not terrible upon release, but boy, something wild happened with Scissor. Coming over from the public test server, it looked like Scissor was going to be an absolute monster inside the game, but it was clearly way undertuned upon release. I'm not sure exactly why, but something from the public test server translated to this Pokemon is way too powerful, and they nerfed it before release. This was one of the first gems only releases that was incredibly weak. It was pay to lose at that time with Scissor and Scyther, and for whatever reason, they just really missed the mark with the release of this Pokemon. It's had multiple adjustments since its release, and now Scissor is in a kind of okay place inside the game, as well as Scyther, even though I think both of these Pokemon could still use a little love to be more prominent inside the meta. Number 7 is a Pokemon that maybe should have never been buffed, but it is Comfey. Without question, Comfey was one of the most releases inside of Pokemon Unite. It was clearly weak, but then it got massive buffs and became what is now essentially the broken Pokemon accelerator. This Pokemon is so incredible incredibly busted because it lets another busted Pokemon live for a much longer time and survive situations it couldn't, so it could be more busted forever. I'm sure we all remember Zacian and Comfey. It was an absolute nightmare, and Comfey really hasn't been toned down enough since then. I still think this Pokemon needs kind of some substantial nerfs, and it's funny because looking back on it, while Comfey was very, very weak upon release, and no question it felt weak, that is maybe the state it should have stayed in, because otherwise this Pokemon was just, well, it is what it currently is, and we will always hate Comfey a little bit. Our number 6 Pokemon is Mammo Swine. Mammo Swine was an early release inside of Pokemon Unite, being announced right alongside of Sylveon. And I don't know if you remember Sylveon, but Sylveon was insanely good, and Mammo Swine was insanely mid. It was just such a bizarre release, especially having to compete alongside other defenders like Snorlax and Blastoise. Mammo Swine just felt clunky. All of its moves really needed a good tuning, and it had a very weird leveling system. I don't know if you have been playing Pokemon Unite long enough to remember the time when Pokemon like Mammo Swine, Garchomp, Gardevoir all needed to get up to like level 10 to get their abilities. Maybe Gardevoir was the exception there, but there were Pokemon that needed to get to level 10 to evolve, and one of them was Mammo Swine, and it's just such a bizarre situation for a Pokemon that really did not deserve that kind of leveling curve. Since release, Mammo Swine has gotten a ton of buffs, and it's actually in an okay place in the meta right now. It's just a weird defender because it doesn't have a ton of self-sustain, and any defender without a ton of self-sustain can be targeted down pretty quickly. I still do love Mammo Swine, but maybe it could use the ability to heal itself. Now we're getting crazy. Now we're getting crazy. Number 5 is Buzzwole. Buzzwole was another one of these beasts, an ultra beast, if you will. Ding! That was a joke. It was another one of these beasts from the public test server that we really expected to dominate inside the game. Playing it on the PTS, I thought Buzzwole was going to be like the end-all be-all inside of Pokemon Unite. Its ability to move other Pokemon around the battlefield, the amount of damage it did, it just felt like Buzzwole was going to take over the game. But when it entered Unite, it was pretty... One of the biggest changes to Buzzwole, obviously, was being able to charge its muscle gauge off of wild Pokemon. Once it got this, it actually became a real force to be reckoned with in the hands of a high-skilled player. It's one of those Pokemon that definitely requires a high skill level to compete with, but if you have it, Buzzwole is now amazing. It's one of my favorite Pokemon, and you can really run circles around your opponents. Incredible secure early, and then its moves later in the game create unparalleled combos that just destroy multiple enemies on the opposing team. Right now, Buzzwole is in a great state. However, man, at release, what a disappointing release for the Buzzy Boy. Number 4 on our list is another defender that makes it here, and it's Trevenant. Trevenant, upon release, was just not at all the Trevenant we know today. Woodhammer has since received multiple buffs. Curse has. Pain Split finally received a buff. For the longest time, I'm not sure if you remember this, but Pain Split did nothing. For the only pain that you were splitting is between you and your allies because you picked Pain Split. Pain Split was so terrible for so long. Leech Life was always the play, and Leech Life is still probably the better move after the Pain Split sort of semi-nerf after it was buffed a little while back. But Trevenant, for the longest time, really had no place inside the game. They finally made the Curse build viable, and then it took them a long time, but they finally made Woodhammer viable. Now Trevenant is an absolute force inside of Pokemon Unite, but that release was pretty not great. Our number 3 Pokemon on the list was so bad that I named an entire tier after it after its release, and that Pokemon is Decidueye. Our D tier is memorialized as the Decidueye Memorial tier because this Pokemon released and it was just bad. Just awful. Just... terrible. Obviously, they were trying to balance the fact that this Pokemon was going to be a long-range sniper, but it used to have one charge of its snipe shot with a very, very high cooldown. So even if you wanted to play the snipe shot build, you just really weren't able to output the kind of damage you needed to. Not only that, this Pokemon is incredibly squishy, and it was just really difficult to survive any engagement. Decidueye is another one of those Pokemon that's gone through a long list of buffs to finally be something something that you can actually play inside of a match. Now you can play Decidueye, do a ton of damage, and still get kind of deleted pretty quickly. Because let's face it, you're Decidueye, you're a squishy owl, and everyone is going to beat you up. Finally, Decidueye is good, but you will forever have a tier named after you, unless maybe Zarina takes that at some point. It was really hard to decide where to place a few of these top Pokemon, but our number 2 release was super underwhelming, and that is Azumarol. Azumarol, I think, was a very head-scratchy release. It needed so many buffs, so many changes, and some of the changes haven't exactly been good for this Pokemon. It's one of the weirdest releases inside the game, and it's had a very weird trajectory with buffs and nerfs. The idea behind it sounded pretty amazing, that you would always critically hit if you're hitting one enemy Pokemon, but it just was not powerful enough. Play rough was absolutely awful. Whirlpool and Aqua Tail both had some uses inside the game, especially considering that you could do damage through shields, but it just really didn't amount to anything inside of a match. The huge benefit Azumarol did have is that this was back when Unite moves kind of gave you this crazy steroid inside the game. They've since sort of been fixed where each class, and even more specifically Pokemon inside those classes, give you different buffs when you use their Unite moves, but it actually did have sort of a delete button. It's probably the best thing Azumarol had going for it. Since Azumarol's release, we've had a ton of buffs, a few kind of confusing nerfs to this Pokemon, and it still sits in this very, very bizarre place. But I want you to remember that at one point you had to hit level 5 to evolve with Azumarol, and it really is just... why? Why did they do that? Why did they do that to Azumarol? A very weak release. And our number 1 weakest release, of course, is Mewtwo. Goodbye, everybody. I love you.